Hello, everyone, and welcome to CIJ Summer Conference. This is day 4, our last day and our last free talk, and we have a real treat for you. We have an absolute dream lineup. But before we start, I would like to invite you all, those who are watching on Zoom, to use Zoom's Q&A function at the bottom to ask your questions. And those who are joining us on YouTube, you can press questions there, but there might be a delay because we'll have to retype it. If you would like to tweet about it, please use hashtag CIJ Summer and tag us in at CI Journalism. And now I leave you in Rosalind Russell's capable hands, who is going to be this event's chair, and she will introduce all the speakers.
Thank you, Marina, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us, and it's a real honor to have two really well-known and highly thought of investigative journalists with us, Michela Wrong and Erick Kabendera. Welcome to you both. Michela is a journalist and author, the author of 4 non-fiction books about Africa, about DRC, Eritrea, Kenya, and most recently her book on Rwanda, Do Not Disturb, which I have a copy here with me, which is a real sort of devastating investigation which centers on the murder of a political dissident, Patrick Carragher, in Rwanda. Erick is an investigative journalist who has paid a heavy price for his journalism in his home country of Tanzania. He's worked for many media outlets, including The Guardian, The Economist, East African, Africa Confidential, with his investigations into corruption in government, the extractives industry, and other issues in Tanzania and the region. And he will tell you about the consequences of his work, the personal consequences that's had for him. I'd like to start by asking both of you if you could outline your experience and expertise in this area of investigations. I'll start with Michela because you're unmuted. So if you can explain a little bit to us about how your work has focused on investigating to get to the truth.
Thank you, Ros. You were very modest and didn't actually introduce yourself. Do you want to, because it's not as though you haven't done investigative reporting yourself. Do you want to talk a bit about your own sort of career?
Well, I'm talking to you as somebody who has also reported from Africa, from East Africa, and across the region as a Reuters correspondent. And I recently published my own book, which is about South Sudan and Uganda. So yes, that's where those are my credentials for hosting the meeting today.
Right.
But yes, as an investigator, I think you two are really, that's the heart of the work that you do. So if you can outline a little bit about that, that would be great.
And I'm so pleased that Erick could join us on this panel, because I've watched Erick's travails, as I think they're called, over the last few years, and I'm really worried about him. And I think he was in a really dicey situation, and he's going to tell us more about that. And the kind of experiences Erick's gone through are nothing like the experiences that I've had as a journalist. And I'm very aware that that's because, you know, I come back to London and I have a British passport. And I think we're going to talk about some of these issues later on, because these are great protections if you're an investigative journalist working in some of the countries both he and I have worked in. So I started off at Reuters like you did, Ros, and did, I think it was 9 years there, working in France, Italy, Côte d'Ivoire, and eventually in what was then Zaire. And then worked for the Financial Times for 6 years. and started writing books at a certain stage when my boss, who liked to tell people to go off and write books, did that to me, Michael Holman, and said, it's time for you to write a book. And I had no idea what I was going to write about at the time, and wasn't particularly keen on the idea. But that was when I began working on In the Footsteps of Mr. Kurtz, which was a book about Mobutu, but also about daily life in Zaire. And I think what I realized is that as you go along, and if you do write books that begin to be in depth, you inevitably tread on people's toes. And I never really thought of myself as an investigative journalist, but I realize I now am. And I think the first time I really sort of began to annoy people was with my second book, which was about Eritrea and was called I Didn't Do It For You, because there were a few final chapters where I was basically conveying a sense of deep disappointment at what had happened in Eritrea with this former rebel group that was now running the country, and the kind of bullying and physical bullying that President Isaias Afwerki went in for with his staff members. And I think the references, I made mention of the fact that Isaias Afwerki used to sometimes beat his fellow colleagues around the head with a whiskey bottle when he was a little worse for wear, and that was just not acceptable. And I think I would find it very difficult to get a visa now to go back to Eritrea because of that. I had been very careful in my reporting until the book came out, and then after that I sort of realized the book had come out. I probably wasn't going to go back, and so I was less discreet. The big experience of sort of realizing how you annoy people in power was It's Our Turn to Eat, which was my book about Anglo leasing. The Anglo leasing was a military procurement scandal in Kenya, which was exposed by John Githongo, the anti-corruption czar, who had been appointed by President Mwai Kibaki, and who came across this major military procurement scandal and then realized slowly but surely that his own colleagues, people he looked up to and respected, were deeply involved in that, and decided to blow it, to reveal all, but fled abroad before he did so. And I mean, I knew when I was writing that book that it was controversial, but I don't think I appreciated quite how controversial it was, because a lot of this had been in the newspapers. The Daily Nation, what was then a very pioneering, campaigning newspaper, had published a lot of the details of Anglo leasing. And I sort of thought, in a way, I was just summarizing it and adding the sort of personal elements that I knew because I was a friend of John Githongo's, told me a lot of the background story. And I was quite surprised when, as soon as the book came out, it was pirated. There was a PDF circulating that was pirated. None of the bookshops in Kenya would stock it. People were selling it under the counter, like pornography or drugs. People, I ended up in parking lots in London handing over 20 copies, 25 copies to Kenyans who were flying back to Nairobi, and they were selling those books in the airport car park in Nairobi. So it was very exciting, but also frustrating, because obviously if you write a book, you want people to be able to freely buy it. And it felt to me ridiculous, because a lot of this was in the public domain already. So why were people, the bookshop owners were themselves so frightened? Why were they so frightened? And it ended up, the PDF ended up on several people's websites for free downloading, and one of them was WikiLeaks. So then we had to appeal to WikiLeaks to take it down. So it was all quite difficult. I think with my latest book on Rwanda, which is Do Not Disturb, which you mentioned, I've always known it was going to be a controversial book. I mean, there was never any doubt, because the subject matter is so hot. It really focuses on the human rights abuses committed by President Paul Kagame, and in particular it focuses on what has essentially been a campaign to take out, beat up, assassinate, silence, crush dissidents who have fled the country and gone abroad, and a very, very concerted, relentless campaign that has largely been ignored, politely and discreetly ignored by Western allies of Rwanda. So that was always, I knew, going to be a very hot topic. And so it has proved. I mean, we'll probably talk about this later, but it's had a very sort of sensational emotional response. So there are some people who absolutely love the book. There are other people who are supporters of Kagame who've denounced it. And I think, you know, what I find is that back when I worked for Reuters, like you, Ros, you were sort of encouraged never to have any opinions, but I'm that much older now. It's sort of 3 decades on, and I've become, you know, an opinionated person who writes investigative journalism that annoys people. So anyway, I'll just leave it there, but that's a summary of my kind of investigative journalism to date.
Right, that's very impressive, thank you. And Erick, can you tell us a bit more about your investigations and how you started as an investigative journalist?
So mainly, I started off in Tanzania 18 years ago for a newly established newspaper by Nation Media Group, which was remains the biggest newspaper company in East Africa. So, my focus was mainly on education policy, but I think through doing my work locally, I realized that Tanzania was the gateway into part of Southern Africa and Eastern Africa and Central Africa, which basically made it possible, for example, for criminal networks to operate, you know, use the port. And it was a country that had porous borders that actually made it easy for international criminal networks in East Central Africa and Southern Africa to use Tanzania, and that actually interested me to focus in looking into illegal trade business that were done through Dar es Salaam. And of course, I developed interest as well in investigating Tanzania military operations in various countries of, say, DRC, where, you know, the global story, the narrative has basically left out Tanzania, yet it's been a critical player, you know, in covert military operations there. And I paid attention to the peace efforts that Tanzania was doing in other parts of the region, such as Rwanda. But of course, the stories that were untold, you know, through the country's involvement in these areas. But I think in the past 6 years, things had changed. While I was focusing mainly on the regional stories that, you know, connects Tanzania with the rest of the countries on the continent. Back in Tanzania, where you had quite an unconventional president, and I felt that as a journalist, I needed to pay more attention to my country, where, you know, journalists and media in general felt intimidated to be able to speak out and tell the truth. So as I focused on that, you know, sort of trying to demystify a president that everybody across the world was showering prizes with, you know, sort of looking at these shadow dealings and his business associates, his political allies, and things that they were involved in and under the carpet. And I think because local and regional, and for that matter, international newspapers that I was freelancing for, were unable to publish some of these stories, because doing so, they felt they would have put me in danger. So most of the stories I was working on, I would say 60% of the stories were not getting published because I needed to gather as much evidence as possible. You know, given the background of Tanzania, a socialist, you know, country with close networks, with people, even for experienced journalists like myself, not being able to speak up the truth. Sources worried that the president might come after them. So I felt my role wasn't actually to get a story out. My role was to gather all the important evidence so I can be able to piece together everything. And in so doing, I think I got too close to the story. I got too close to the president, and in the process, before I went to prison, I survived about 2 assassination attempts. I had rogue intelligence operators coming after me, and in the end, I ended up in prison. But even after being in prison, I think it just gave me an opportunity to look back and reflect at the stories I'd been working on. But at the same time, people that I'd been investigating in the past, some of the great stories that I'd worked in the past, but I was unable to complete. Some of these people, I was able to meet with them in prison. So as much as it was a painful experience, being in prison, surviving an assassination attempt, being under emotional pressure, but it also gave me an opportunity sort of to continue working as an investigative journalist. But I think for what we've seen in the last 6 years, talking about the region, the biggest media houses in the region, is that getting the truth out as a reporter, where a publisher is involved in multiple business interests, could be very risky, especially to a journalist trying to get out the truth, where especially it contravenes with the interest of the state and the interest of the publishers.
Yes, thank you. Well, there's a lot to unpick there. Thanks, Erick and Michela. I think one of the interesting things that you've both touched on is the fact that, I think when we think of investigative journalists, we kind of think of detectives, that you're really uncovering things that nobody has thought of before or knows about. But I think one of the things that you've both mentioned is that a lot of your reporting and investigations were on about things that were actually in plain sight. And so how much of your role is really making the connections between what we already know and coming to perhaps a different conclusion to the general consensus that already existed? Michela, could you speak about that?
Yeah, yes, I think with Rwanda, that's been particularly obvious to me, that I was constantly interviewing people, whether they were Rwandans or Ugandans themselves, but also Rwanda, of course, is a place that a lot of Western countries are heavily invested in. A lot of philanthropic foundations have put a lot of money into Rwanda. So you're constantly talking to development experts or people working for NGOs or economists or diplomats who have a very realistic and sometimes quite skeptical view of Rwanda and what's going on there, especially the Rwandan story of the development miracle that has been very much touted as Rwanda's story since the genocide. And it becomes very frustrating because they all behave as though the whole world knows that the statistics don't add up, that the statistics have been tweaked by the Rwandan government, that the economic miracle is an impressive performance, but by no means a miracle, that there are really deep concerns about governance, about rigged election. Every election doesn't really pass muster, which is why nobody bothers to send international election observers to Rwanda, and that people are disappearing and fleeing and are never seen again. And there's a really, really sinister side to Rwanda's story, but they don't want to be quoted. And I think what you get in Rwanda, and you get this in quite a lot of African countries, and I think Tanzania is also one of them, because Tanzania everyone thought was the socialist story, the benign socialist story, is a consensus, a lazy consensus that forms. Maybe we tend to do this more with Africa as outsiders, Western outsiders. This is the way the country is, and then you don't want to re-examine your assumptions. It's fixed in stone, and you don't want to consider any challenging information. So it became very difficult. I mean, in my reference notes, I have again and again and again, I have to say, interview with author, anonymity requested. And this isn't just Rwandans and Ugandans who feared for their personal security, quite rightly so in my view, because the Rwandan state reaches out across its borders to intimidate and to target people. But it was also economists, diplomats, former ambassadors, people who wanted to go and do consultancy work in Rwanda, and they didn't want to challenge the consensus. And this is why I called my book Do Not Disturb, because I became very frustrated with that whole kind of lazy, and really this very powerful sense of, we have a story, don't rock the boat. This is what we're telling ourselves about Rwanda. This is what allows us to keep giving a lot of aid to the country. This is what means that Paul Kagame gets invited to Davos every year. And I think it's a really, really dangerous thing. So yeah, as an investigative journalist, I again, with Rwanda, I didn't feel I was exposing massive secrets. Mm-hmm. I just felt I was teasing out what people said to me very openly, but then would say, don't quote me, don't use my name. So, and that's really frustrating, because what it means is that you as a journalist end up with your head on the line because they won't put their head on the line.
Yes. And Erick, can you sort of give some examples of stories you've done where you've really been piecing together evidence that already exists or is already in the public domain, but you're putting it together in a different way to tell a different story?
I would say one of my favorite story was basically about the Tanzania, as I said initially, the Tanzania involvement in DRC, because I think the internet
in the war in DRC,
absolutely in the Great War in 2003. Mm-hmm. So I think the narrative had been that Tanzania was involved in DRC as a peacemaker, but I think on the other hand, what people didn't know that Tanzania basically had deployed troops there, to involve in a covert operation. So everybody talked about Tanzania, of course, being a country that was helping to bring peace in DRC. Of course, Laurent Kabila had waged his guerrilla warfare from Tanzania, and of course that's the story that was being known. But what wasn't known was that the DRC government had paid Tanzania in the tune of about $5 million to have its reserve, and active military to intervene and help them. And I think I had been chasing that story for about 5 years when I met soldiers who had participated in the operation to say, look, we were given contracts, it's 250 of us, money was paid, but it never got to us. And after 6-7 years is when they're opening up to tell you this story, and then everything I was, basically made sense to say, this is what everybody knew. Now that I have evidence to be able to tell a story in a different perspective. And I think that story opened doors into understanding Tanzania involvement in DRC. For example, Michela talks about the assassination of Laurent Kabila, but I think what most people didn't know is that Tanzanian military was protecting him until about 2 weeks before his assassination. So I think this is a story that, because apparently nothing happens in Tanzania, laid back socialist country. So I think he's managed to get away with a lot of things. And my role as a journalist is sort of being patient, of course, because getting evidence is gonna take you time, and being consistent, staying on the story until the end when there is something tangible for you to be able to report about.
You both talked about getting too close to the story. And I imagine that when you are so engrossed in investigating a particular thing, it becomes an obsession. How do you then sort of stand back to make it accessible to people, to readers, to understand why what you have revealed or discovered is significant? Michela.
I think that's a good question. I mean, you always end up jettisoning quite a lot of the stuff that you find fascinating, or you should jettison it, because you've got to keep a storyline that's simple enough for people to understand. I mean, Erick's been talking about who he writes his articles for. I always try and write books for both a Western audience and an African audience at the same time. And that's sort of very difficult straddling to do. And it does mean that detail that would work and that would resonate with an African audience won't work, will just confuse a Western audience. I mean, with my Do Not Disturb book, I've already had people saying, all the names are so confusing. And you kind of think, yeah, because Rwandan names, often begin with K. And so do all the place names as well. And if you've never been to any of those places, they're a bit abstract. And so you really, because I'm writing for that Western audience and an African audience, you do have to just jettison stuff and think, okay, this interests me, but it's not going to be in the book. But I'm glad I know it. So that's what I do as a Western writer.
You still have that authority, in a way. Yeah. So it's important still that you have that.
Yes. And I guess that's where with the book, the reference notes comes in. And, some of this detail just ends up in the reference notes because, most people aren't going to want it. And what I've noticed with the passing of the years is with my first book on Mobutu, I hardly had any reference notes because I didn't like reference notes when I was reading books. And now, as my books go on, the reference notes get longer and longer and longer.
Right.
And they are partly about demonstrating that you've done your homework.
Yeah, and you can defend your thesis. Yeah.
Yeah.
And Erick, I imagine there's a contradiction for you because, as we've discussed beforehand, some of your stories are so explosive that it's hard for you to get them placed in African media. African media can be reluctant to take some of these stories. But at the same time, if you're looking at international news outlets, the granularity of what you're writing about may be beyond some readers. So how do you navigate between those two?
Well, as a freelance journalist, I think that becomes a struggle because in the end, you've got to be able to pay your expenses and bills and through your work as a journalist, and a story that may appeal to an audience in East Africa might not appeal to a British audience or the Western audience. I think that always a confusion, and you may find that maybe 90% of the stories that would appeal to East African audience might not necessarily make it into the Western media if you pitched it to Western media. So that is always a struggle, and you've got always to find something that interests the Western audience, and the best way to do that is to be able to understand a story as an expert and always look for various angles that may appeal to various audiences, and that always is just not easy. For example, if you look into regional stories in East Africa, of course, Western audiences might be interested in Western businesses that do not follow the law, while operating in DRC, operating in mining businesses in the region, and or get basically compromised in the process of dealing with the local businesses that operate in the region. But at the same time, I think for the audiences that I primarily wrote for, which is basically a regional audience, you always have to struggle to find a balance, a story that not only affects Tanzania, that also affects Rwanda, that affects Burundi, that affects DRC, or that which affects the entire region. So it's quite a tricky balance, which you don't always get it right all the time. But I think at the same time, I think the most important lesson that I've learned as a journalist working in the region, you always have to carry the notion at the back of your mind that the publisher's interest might be implicated in the story that you're working on. So if a story touches on the interest of the publisher in the region, you have to understand that that story will never come out, or if it came out, maybe editors would basically heavily edit it to reflect the realities, which basically means letting you publish or the owner of the company you work for, not being mentioned.
Could you give us an example of that?
Well, an example, I think it is an open truth. For example, if you looked in, for example, Nation Media Group, it's the biggest media house in the region. Mm-hmm. It's owned by Aga Khan. Aga Khan has businesses in insurance. He has businesses in hotels. He's got businesses in financial institutions. So if there was a story that implicated, for example, a bank that is owned by Aga Khan, definitely that wouldn't get published. And yet, he is the biggest publisher, in the region. If you didn't work for the Aga Khan and you are a regional journalist, who would you work for?
So can I just butt in? Yeah, because the East African magazine, which I used to read religiously because it's a very good regional business newspaper, its coverage of Rwanda is absolutely shocking. Absolutely shocking. I mean, it is completely silent on anything that might be construed as criticism of the government or the regime in Rwanda, and absolutely, predictably, when they reviewed my book Do Not Disturb, it was the one stinker of a review, and I think the Daily Nation has been entirely silent on my book, and because they just don't want to go there. And if you Google Daily Nation, Aga Khan and Rwanda, you soon see why, because there's a whole load of stories about how the Aga Khan is hoping to open a newspaper in Kigali. So he has no interest in offending a regime that's deeply, deeply intolerant of criticism in the press. And that's a really major issue, because as Erick was saying, that's the biggest empire, press, media empire in East Africa. It's incredibly influential. And then, I can give countless examples of African magazines in particular that are so close to the Rwandan government, so keen to impress it, that they will never, ever knowingly publish a word of criticism, and in fact will go out of their way to commission negative criticism of people like me who are sort of standing up and saying the emperor has no clothes. Astonishing level of sycophancies on show at the Jeune Afrique, African Business Magazine, at the Africa Report. And it does make you realize how difficult it is. I mean, I'm lucky because I live in Britain and I can work for outlets here in the West. But if I was based on the continent like Erick, and I was trying to write for African outlets and I was saying anything that was remotely critical of Rwanda, I mean, no one's going to publish them. It's a really kind of, it's a stranglehold. Yes.
And we're certainly going to talk a bit more about the consequences of the reporting that you've both done on, for both of you. And I'd just like to say for people listening in, please use the Q&A function. We'll continue the discussion, but I'd like to ask your questions as well. So please use the Q&A function to ask questions for Michela and Erick. For any sort of budding investigative journalists who are in this session, I think it would be good to talk about sources, which are obviously the foundation of your reporting and investigations. Can I ask, Michela, you've spoken a little bit about it already, but maybe to Erick first. How do you build trust with your sources? What sort of tips do you have for building trust with your sources? How much has people's reluctance to speak to you impacted your investigations, and what lengths do you go to protect your sources? Erick.
Most of the sources, basically, sources that you have built over the years, and I think some of the painful experiences is that you spend most of your time, say 60% as an investigative journalist, trying to maintain relationship, nurturing relationship with sources, other than publishing stories, and most of the stories that you're working on, sources would provide sort of opaque description or tips because they are scared to release all the information, or because they're concerned that if they give away the entire story, and they belong to a small inner circle that knows that story, definitely once it's published, everything, all the fingers will be pointed at them. So it's if you look in the past 6 years, the number of stories that I have been working on versus the stories that I've been able to publish, the gap is so big, because I have been on some of the stories, like I have been sitting on 35 stories, very, very good stories for the last 6 years that I'm struggling to be able to get evidence for, for them to have the credibility to be published. And the truth is just out there. You get a couple of sources to corroborate some of the information you have, but you need to be able to get paper trail. And in a country that basically has, closed door policy, where everything is hidden, where you struggle basically to get even basic information about government activities, it takes you a lot more work to be able to get out a big story that has impact. So the balance, as always, that I'm going to focus on sort of strong analysis, make sure that I publish 3 of those or 4 of those in a month. Mm-hmm. As I have more time to keep pursuing this story, it might take me longer, maybe 8 years, to get these stories done. But I think in the end, the effort is rewarding.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty impressive work rate, actually. Even with a lot of the stories sort of staying in your notebook. Michela, can you talk about sources? I mean, you've discussed this really interestingly at the beginning of your book. So I'd like to hear about that.
I felt I had to take head on this the whole issue of the unreliability of sources, because you're talking about a closed society, Erick, and you know, nowhere's more closed than Rwanda. And I talk about this in the introduction. The extent to which Rwandan society, maybe because of its roots in a royal monarchy, you know, the court really prides itself on keeping its secrets close to its chest and not letting outsiders get a glimpse of what's going on behind closed doors. And that really is a massive problem for journalists, especially, I think, Western journalists, because, you know, I was constantly being told by Rwandans that I shouldn't trust other Rwandans, that I was being lied to, that my sources would take huge pleasure in lying to me, specifically because I was a Western journalist, and the whole point is to kind of spin you a line. So, I mean, the only way I could deal with that in the book really is to be honest about the level of ambiguity and nuance and uncertainty that always accompanies these kind of investigations. You talked about the absence of a paper trail. That's such a massive problem. And when we're talking about the absence of a paper trail, you're not just talking about the absence of government documents, you're also talking about the absence of newspaper cuttings, for example, you know, trying to cover what happened in 1990 where the Rwandan Patriotic Front invaded Rwanda. I remember going to consult old Ugandan newspapers, and there's really, really very little record now of what they reported at the time. The cuttings library is no longer well maintained. It was the kind of thing that depended on donors. Even the newspapers, key important newspapers, don't keep very good records of their own coverage. So there often is no paper trail. So you are relying on oral testimonies, on memories of people who used to say something different often. I mean, one of the key issues, I think, is so many of my sources were in intelligence, in Rwandan intelligence or Ugandan intelligence. So they'll talk to you, but it's understood that you will never cite them. But also, you know, you're always aware, you know, Kagame himself was trained in military intelligence. My key protagonist was the head of external intelligence. Most of my sources were at one stage in intelligence. You're very aware that those people spinning a line, creating a narrative, selling it to foreign journalists is their job. And I mean, I found in the book that all I could do was acknowledge the problem that poses, and then try and work out, on the basis of what as many sources as you can get tell you, what probably is the truth. But there's always an ambiguity there. I imagine, Erick, that a lot of your sources are intelligence as well, right?
Yeah, because, you know, typical of a socialist country where majority of the public officials would be, you know, would have background in intelligence, and this basically would be the people that you would interact with, and at the same time, you know, I find quite interesting that in the environment I work in, you'd always have people in the intelligence being more willing to share information with you, compared to people in the government. But as you rightly said, the reason they are forthcoming is because it's part of their job to be able to deceive journalists. So always true. So the lesson I've learned is that the commentaries, the tips that I take from friends working in the intelligence community, I'll basically take them as the beginning of an investigation, because primarily, if you look back in the last 20 years, or the major stories that were published in Tanzania that had big impact, you know, majority of them, if not all of them, originated from the intelligence. And I think the truth that we have not been able to face as journalists is that, you know, 5 years down the line, when you get to learn that the story you were given was one-sided, and there were certain interests that needed to be protected, and you ended up actually walking into that trap, you were unable to go back and say, by the way, this was the truth. That hasn't happened. I think these lessons have taught me as a journalist to be really careful and do my homework. And I would rather not publish a story for 5 years until I'm sure that the information I've been given is correct, and that there are no interests that they are intending to serve. And I think that the red flag that I have come across is that when a source from the intelligence community gives you a tip, and you don't publish for a month or two, you basically see that story in another newspaper, and basically it will be published the way it was given to you. So you know basically they were interested that they were intending to serve. So I think this line about being able to realize that this is not correct takes a lot of efforts in having a pool of sources, knowledgeable sources, to confirm what is true, sources in countries where you don't have paper trail with incredible institutional memory to be able to say, this is the truth, this is my side of the story. And in that process, it takes you ages to be able to get a common narrative, to make a story out of it.
Yeah, I mean, Michela, you said previously that really this very ambitious work and the 4 years of work that went into writing your book has been a sort of process of atonement for feeling that you got the story wrong in the first place as a younger journalist. And you've also talked about a sort of cowardliness of some people who have been reluctant to speak to you on the record. Obviously, we can understand why some people would be putting themselves in real danger to speak to journalists, but why do you think there's this real wall of secrecy around Rwanda in particular?
Well, I have huge sympathy and empathy and for any Rwandan or Ugandan who didn't want to talk to me or talk to me on the understanding it was off the record, because there were so many examples of Rwanda reaching out and hunting people down, not just in Rwanda, but as far abroad as Canada, Australia, America, Europe, that I completely understood the nervousness, and I did feel I was duty bound to observe their desire for anonymity. What I had much less patience with, because I think it's positively damaging and dangerous, is the way in which you'd be meeting diplomats or academics or development experts who would say, well, of course, this is happening, and of course the official story is nothing, is misleading, and it's all gold, coated, gold coated, and we know this and we know that, and often I felt that they wanted to carry on working as consultants there. There's a lot of consultancy work after you retire if you're a diplomat, but also there was this cowardice, which was the World Bank and IMF and various key donors have agreed what the story is on Rwanda, and the story is that it's a success story and it's an example to Africa, and we want other people to follow its example. And if you stand up and challenge that, you're going to find that your reputation as an academic or an analyst, an expert, will come under fire. And I sort of thought that doesn't make sense, because eventually this stuff will come out, and this, there did seem to me to be parallels with the kind of useful idiots, as we call them, who used to make excuses for and pretend that there were no gulags in Stalin's Soviet Union. And eventually we will know the truth. And then, you who have been the well-known reputed academic expert on Rwanda, will be asked, well, why didn't you say something earlier? So it seems to me, but I do feel with Rwanda that a tipping point is being reached, and that people are now saying, okay, let's be a bit more open about what's really going on there.
That's interesting. There's a couple of questions from the audience I'd like to put to you. The first one is, do you feel optimistic about the possibilities of increasing cross-border reporting for getting some of these untold stories out in Africa? Erick, have you seen any evidence of that collaboration between journalists from different countries, perhaps?
Well, unfortunately not. Unfortunately not. The collaboration doesn't exist, and I think we potentially, with journalists coming from Western countries, when they come, they come with their line of stories, which in most cases may be wrong. And once someone, basically have decided this is the story they want to do, there is nothing you can do to change them, sort of provide a different perspective that leads into the real story. But at the same time, investigations require massive funding, to be able to do them. And internationally and regionally, majority of the media companies have cut down on the budgets. It doesn't seem to be a lot of interest and excitement of pursuing cross-border reporting. I must admit that Bloomberg did a fantastic story on Kabila and his business associates. I think that was the best cross-border collaboration that has been done in the past 6 years. The opportunities are there, because if you look into the trade relations between the rest of the world with the region is quite increased, and because the ties are increasing, that provides an opportunity for the multi practices, the political involvement, deal cutting, all these issues. But I think it's an opportunity that, a journalist who is interested, I would argue it's the future of journalism in Eastern Central Africa, cross-border collaboration. And another good example is what is happening now in northern Mozambique. So the tendencies for majority of the reporters, Western and regional reporters, covering that story as a standalone story, but actually it's a regional story that requires journalists to come together and be able to piece the evidence together from each of these countries to get to understand the rising Islamist insurgency and how this is affecting businesses and the welfare of ordinary people.
But it's not happening very much, that kind of cross-border cooperation and reporting. I suppose it's hugely expensive, for one thing.
Absolutely. It's not. And there is not only expensive, but it's basically a lack of interest. Media houses are quite impatient, spending resources doing a story that would last 3 months or 6 months, unless, a major non-profit organization comes in to support that. But the initiatives are not coming from the media outlets themselves. Editors, if you look at editors, I freelance for a European newspapers. It's something that they wouldn't be interested in doing unless there was an easy story to be done and fill the pages, on short term.
That takes us to a question from Lionel Fall, actually, for both of you, which he's asking, are there any publications or initiatives in Africa that are doing a good job of reporting at the moment? I suppose in the investigative field we're thinking about.
Yeah, I think if I can think of some things that have impressed me recently, I was very impressed by, I hope I get it right, I think it was RFI, Arno Zeitman's reportage into the assassination of Laurent Kabila, which was clearly a piece of work that he had spent years on. And it really showed, and he had all sorts of different voices, different inputs from, people who'd been involved in various stages of that process, the assassination, witnesses, the trial. That was a very good piece of work. I think Al Jazeera has done some really important work, and it's sort of on the lines that Erick is describing. There've been some, I'm now sort of on the spot and forgetting who's responsible, but there've been some very good investigations into atrocities committed. For example, I think it was CNN's work on the atrocities that have been committed in Tigray recently by the Ethiopian army against local Tigrayans, looking at the granularity and the evidence showing, who took those photos, when they were taken, where the bodies lied. I mean, that was very impressive work. And I think it was the BBC that was involved in doing some similar kind of forensic, looking at pictures taken of a mass killing in Cameroon a couple of years ago, in which some women were taken off and shot in a field, and they worked out where it was done, how, and by who. I think
Amnesty as well did that in Tigray.
Amnesty's done that in Myanmar, I think, wasn't it? In Rohingya.
They did one from aerial photos in Tigray.
Yeah. I think that works really good, especially when it's teamed up with journalistic values. You know, maybe a human rights organization getting together with a journalistic outfit that knows how to then tell the story and talk to witnesses. So there's definitely been good work, but these are the big organizations. If you look at them, those are all big organizations with big fund, you know, money and manpower and the ability to dedicate years, if necessary, to the stories. Yeah.
Andrew Weir just makes a comment. He wants to put in a word for Africa Confidential there, who I know that Erick's written for. So I've got to power through some of these questions now because we've only got 5 minutes left. But one, Maria Zlotova says, how do you see China's role in Africa, for good, bad, or both? I don't know if you can answer that very quickly, Erick.
Pardon?
How do you see China's role in Africa? It's a very broad question.
Yeah, I think basically if you freelance for a European newspaper, the story that actually would be given priority is the conduct of the Chinese businesses and Chinese government in the region, and sort of it's a story that when you pitch, it's going to get through. And I think for me, it's true that some of the Chinese contracts in the region are quite questionable. The secrets around these contracts they sign with African governments are, you know, quite questionable. And the fact that some of the stories that we've done in the past have shown that the secrecy provides room for corruption, to money to exchange hands between the Chinese government representatives and the government and African governments. In Tanzania, you know, we have had cases of a pipeline, 575 kilometer that, you know, a government borrowed at you know, $1 billion, you know, 10 years ago. But, you know, it's been constructed, but they can't even make use of 20% of its capacity. So you have governments actually happily going to borrow from, you know, Chinese companies. But at the same time, I think by Western media tending to focus very much on the practices of Chinese businesses, I think the story they don't see is that, you know, Western companies as well, they're getting complacent in their operations in the region. Right. Because if you come into the region where the legal system isn't functioning properly, where governments basically don't work until you cut corners, so they get prone to paying bribes, and they tend to get away because nobody's paying attention to that story because of the thinking that these companies could be held to account back in their countries, but that doesn't happen.
It's interesting.
I think one of the sad things about Chinese influence on Africa is I've certainly seen in Kenya lots of really good Kenyan journalists being sucked up, hoovered up by Chinese media outlets, you know, opening in Africa. And, you know, I'm all for diversity, and the more different outlets, media outlets there are in Africa, the better. But then you have, you know, these aren't media outlets that want to do investigative reporting or any kind of politically contentious reporting. So lots of really good journalists, suddenly all their energies, and they're sort of reining themselves in all the time because they're coming across really good stories and they can't publish them. And that's not a great precedent to set. for Chinese involvement with Africa, just sort of producing this bland, colourless, featureless coverage.
We've only got a couple of minutes left, and I'd like to really, we haven't discussed more fully, I'd like you both to tell me about the consequences personally for you of your investigative work in Africa. Erick, you've touched on your experience, and Yves Laurent is asking, how have you managed to get back on the track of your investigations after being in prison? But maybe if you can talk very briefly about the personal consequences for you.
The personal consequences have been quite high. The price you pay is quite unprecedented. And I think for people not in your shoes, unable to imagine what the governments are capable of doing if you touch on the interests. So for example, most of the media outlets in my country, my home country, and in the region can't take my work, because if you look at the East African, when I went to prison, for example, 2 days before I went to prison, they had published a splash on the front page that I had published. I had written, basically, I'd been investigating for 3 weeks, and when I got a tip from a source on a Monday morning that I was going to be kidnapped, I reached out to say, look, can you help? Help never came through for the 7 months I was in prison, and it's because they had to protect other interests, and understandably they were struggling to get their license in Tanzania, so they needed to step back and say, look, we can't engage you because getting in is just going to complicate matters. So as a freelance journalist working in the region, when you face these consequences, nobody basically wants to reach out because you don't belong to anybody. But at the same time, in my own countries, none of the newspapers can take my work at the moment, because I think it started a while ago where you do stories and always stories, investigative stories are going to have huge impact. And when editors are cornered to explain these stories, they're unable to defend you as a journalist. They're going to throw you under the bus and say, look, we want to be safe, so we won't be able to take your work. So the consequences are quite high in terms of your work, because in the end, people won't be able to publish you, and you won't get paid, you'll be out of work. But at the same time, you sort of journalists see you as one of them, but at the same time an outcast. The narrative for African government, particularly in my country, when you're working for Western media and you sort of always, sniffing around for good stories, they're gonna say you work for the Western intelligence, and this is the narrative that the Tanzanian government pushed prominently in the local press, to say, don't trust him because he's here to serve the interest of Western governments.
It's really shocking, and you kind of understated the way you described what's happened to you. Michela, can you just talk quickly about personal consequences?
Yeah, I mean, what Erick's been through, I feel so spoiled and privileged, because of course none of that has happened to me. I've been sort of barracked on social media. So it's been great, because on the one hand, there have been a lot of people saying, thank God, finally somebody's called out, the emperor has no clothes. And that's really nice to see African readers particularly saying that. But what I think sometimes people don't realize is how very active governments like Rwanda's are on social media, how it is a weapon. It's not the voice of the people, it is the voice of the regime. And in Rwanda, they have something called the Rwanda Twitter army. And, 20 times an hour, my name will be, routinely lambasted, vitriol poured all over me. And I can look at the accounts, the Twitter accounts, and you can see there's 67 followers, 54 followers. They're all saying the same thing, often word for word, reproducing what each other says. And, these aren't real people. These are These are intelligence account, Rwandan military intelligence, Rwandan police. But it's a tide of filth. So, you know, the first thing is, if you're a woman, it's absolutely routine that you're accused of sleeping with all your sources. I've been accused of sleeping with my main protagonist. I've been accused of being Museveni's lover. I've been accused of being a Ugandan spy. I've been accused of working for the French military. I've been accused of being paid $300,000 by the Ugandan intelligence to write my book. It goes on and on and on. And it's sort of like every day there's a new claim. And you look at this and you just sort of think, oh my God, and this is a country that pretends to be, you know, a modern, progressive African democracy. I hope the diplomats and the donors are reading the tweets. I suspect they don't, sadly. But I think you see the real ugly face of a regime on Twitter. And of course, not only on Twitter, it's also, you know, Facebook's, Instagram, all the other. So I think, you know, that's the price I pay. It's nothing compared to what Erick's been through. I mean, I wasn't taken away by the police and thrown into a cell. So I really can't complain. But you do have to be ready. That's coming down the line if you're going to write about a regime like Rwanda's.
Well, thank you both. I mean, we admire you so much. I think you've both shown how unbelievably courageous you are. And it's a really interesting discussion. And I wish we could have talked a little bit more. I haven't got to all the questions, I'm afraid. But thank you very much, Erick and Michela. And over to Marina.
Thank you, Rosalind. And of course, thank you, Michela and Erick, for an excellent discussion. Thank you for everybody who came to listen. And anyone, all of you who attended 1, 2, all 5 talks of our summer conference and some of our courses. This is the end of this year's event. Thank you very much for coming. This video will be available on YouTube, just like all the other videos of all the free talks and some videos of our free workshops. Thank you very much. And we hope to see you in our future events.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you
for having us.